welcome everybody. I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Robert Keohane. He's a professor of Public and International Affairs here at Princeton in the Woodrow Wilson School. Among his many achievements, which I won't go through the full list, he has served as president of the International Studies Association and of the American Political Science Association. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I could go on with books and awards and so on, but you get the picture. This is a very distinguished member of our faculty, and we're really happy to have him here.
Thank you, Ed, very much. I think I'll sit down. It's a small group. And I'm going to talk about, as you know, anti-Americanism and anti-interventionism in Arabic Twitter discourses. And I have to explain two things before I start. That is why I'm involved in this project, being neither technologically very adept nor speaking or reading Arabic, and how this paper came about, and they are linked. Paper came about because I was given an award at Harvard 3 years ago and sat next to my friend Gary King, who's a technologist, the leader of the Harvard Quantitative Social Science Center. And I just read another paper on anti-Americanism, and Gary told me about this firm he'd started called Crimson Hexagon, which is designed to have the Twitter fire hose, as they call it, and have access, therefore, to all Twitter messages, which he uses for commercial purposes. And you can imagine if you were running Procter & Gamble, you'd want to know 2 days later what the new product was how it was seen. So it's probably a very profitable firm, I don't know. But he offered to, since we're friends and co-authors, to give us access to Crimson Hexagon's database and programs for a very small, nominal amount of money. Because we talked, and I said, well, I was very discontented with the work I'd done previously on anti-Americanism because it relied on public opinion polling. Pew does polling every 18 months. It's very expensive. Some countries don't allow it. So Egypt, for example, Saudi Arabia don't allow it. I don't think they poll in Iran. So you have to have access, and you're never quite sure. You have a representative sample, admittedly, which we don't have with Twitter, but you're never quite sure that people really believe what they're saying. They have to give an answer to a pollster and make something up, and you don't have any idea of how intensely they feel about it. So it looked like this would be not necessarily a substitute form of data, but a different form of data. Look at what people were themselves saying about the United States on Twitter. It's only 15% of the population, roughly, in Arabic countries. It's not representative, obviously. These are the more literate, more computer-oriented people, probably younger than the average. But they're also the people who make revolutions. So they're also more important politically. So it's not a representative sample of the population, but it's a set of people we care about. So, and so I recruited Amaney Jamal, who was going to be here today, but who couldn't be because she has a student who is giving a presentation, and that trumps her teaching obligations, trump being here, and my two other colleagues are at Harvard. So let's get this going. Yeah. So what we're interested in more broadly is what I'm calling the discordant discourse of social globalism. That is, long-distance transnational transmission of ideas, which Twitter is, information and images. And this implies a discord because it brings people into contact with each other who have divergent values. And for political scientists, and also Paul for sociologists, social globalism on the web provides new opportunities to study it, because we can observe directly what people are saying, and we don't have to wait for public opinion polls. So the key questions that we're raising are questions that we failed to solve, that Peter Kestlein and I failed to solve in our previous study about 10 years ago, based on public opinion polls. That is, we're interested, first of all, in whether and to what extent Middle Eastern views of American policies are different from Middle Eastern views of U.S. society. We thought, Kestlein and I, in the polling data, that we sensed that there was a distinction, but we couldn't demonstrate it because it wasn't clear enough. The questions weren't clear enough. And we also wanted to know if there's bias. That is, we know and we'll see that there's very negative views on the whole of the United States, and especially of U.S. policy in the Middle East. That won't be a surprise. It doesn't tell us whether in addition to these negative views, there's bias. That is, there's distortion of information processing. People are perceiving things that are manifestly not true, as opposed to simply disliking because their values are different or because they're affected adversely what the U.S. is doing. And in the polling data, you can't get any sense of reaction to particular events because it's once every 18 months you get this very general stuff. We wanted to know what types of events generate anti-American feeling, what types of events generate ambivalence. There's not a lot of straightforward pro-American feeling in this data, but there is ambivalence, as we'll see, as well as very strong anti-American feeling on different issues. So we wanted to know what kinds of events, and we wanted to know, last of all, although this actually came to us fairly late in the study, it wasn't an initial question, whether anti-Americanism is really anti-interventionism, whether it's really distinctive to America, and I'll come to Iran at the end of this talk because we were led there. So we're using Twitter to answer these questions. So I mentioned the access to our data, and that this Twitter analysis is not meant to replace public opinion polling, but it complements it. So what we do, and I am not the technologist in this, is that our Arabic speakers, Amaney Jamal and David Romney, monitor tweets and then read a number of tweets qualitatively to find patterns, identify keywords. And then we essentially ask the computer to tell us how many tweets have similar patterns. You guys have probably done that sort of thing on many different topics. And it's ironic for me, as Paul knows, I am somebody who normally has worked with ends of 1, 2, 5, 10, and here we have millions of tweets, so it's a lot of fun. It's totally different from the other work I've done in the past. So I'm going to talk about the general attitudes on Twitter toward the United States. I'm going to talk about 4 particular sets of, or 5 sets of events, the Syrian civil war compared with the Egypt's military coup, the Innocence of Muslims film, the Boston bombings, and Hurricane Sandy. All these come from 2012-13. So we looked comprehensively at Arabic language tweets between January 1, 2012 and December 31st, 2013. And we're going to ask then, we're going to turn to Iran later and ask, well, is it anti-Americanism or anti-interventionism? Then I'm going to say a word or two about social media discourses and world politics. So the general, yeah, it'd be great. The general attitudes won't surprise you. There's a very negative view of the United States in the Middle East. If we hadn't found that, you'd be sure that our method was wrong. Political tweets outnumber, as we classify them, outnumber social tweets by 4 to 1. That's not so important. That doesn't really matter to us. But and negative political and social tweets outnumber positive ones by over 3 to 1. So it's mostly negative and it's mostly political. That's not surprising. That's exactly what you'd expect from the polling data. So then we looked at some particular events. We looked at the Syrian civil war and Egypt's military coup, because these are important for us because in both cases, people in the Middle East were aligned with actors with which the U.S. was at least somewhat aligned. And so the question is, what happens when people who don't like the United States are confronted with a situation when the United States is supportive, or at least somewhat supportive, of their people? The U.S. was much more anti-Morsi, anti-Muslim Brotherhood than it was anti-military. It has tried to have its hands clean with the military, but clearly was leaning to their side. And it was clearly anti-Assad. This was before the ISIS issue. So there were strong Sunni opponents of Assad, and there were strong military supporters in Egypt, and these people should, if the enemy of my enemy was my friend, they should be pro-American. Paul. Yeah, because it's assessed with the combinations of words. So if you have negative statements associated with the military, we hate the military, they're taking over, that's coded in a way that gets it negative.
So use the dictionary, it's not the sentiment dictionary, it's okay.
We use Senator Dictionary. Do I know the answer to the question? No, but something like that. Yeah. So if we look at the Syria results, there are very few pro-U.S. tweets, as you see, but even the people who are against the regime, look at the negative toward the U.S. anti-regime tweets. There's a substantial number of those, much larger. Of the people who are anti-regime, anti-Assad, 4 times as many are negative toward the U.S. as positive toward the U.S. So it's not the case that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. 87% of the tweets before the chemical weapons attacks, which took place during our period, and 95% afterwards are anti-American. And even of the Assad tweeters, over 80% are anti-American. Now, of course, not surprisingly, the pro-Assad tweeters are essentially all anti-American. You couldn't find any pro-Assad tweeters who were pro-American. So that's evidence for the sort of pervasiveness of anti-American sentiment. I won't say bias. View that even people who you might think, well, they were against Assad, they should be favorable toward us, weren't very favorable. We find the same thing in Egypt. 96% of all tweets are anti-American, which is typical of Egypt. But over 75% of the anti-Morsi tweeters are also anti-American. Now, of course, essentially this means that all of the pro-Morsi tweeters are anti-American, not surprisingly. So there is a difference, but it's overwhelmingly still true that even if the U.S. is aligned, as it was pretty clearly aligned with the military, even with a little bit of a hands-off notion, the anti-American sentiment overrides that. We then looked, I think this is more interesting, at the Innocence of Muslims video. I'll remind you of it. In 2012, a set of people in the United States, based in Florida, I think they were evangelicals, produced this film called The Innocence of Muslims. It was an anti-Muslim film. It raised a big set of issues in the Middle East, lots of tweets on it. And we wanted to know whether those tweets would say, this means look how terrible America is. America's an awful place. They produce this kind of stuff. This is what they all believe. And it's not what we found. We found that, not surprisingly, a large number of people said, just ignore this video, it's terrible. But over a third of the tweets called on U.S. firms to remove the film from social media, like called on Google or Yahoo to remove it. And in our view, this is not what people do when you find some entity as totally hostile to you. You don't appeal to it. We don't appeal to ISIS to stop doing things. We may appeal to the Saudi regime to do things as we're sort of ambivalent about them, but we don't appeal to ISIS. And very few, less than 18% of the posts, apart from the ones just retweeting the news, could be interpreted as attacks on American society. So fewer than I actually expected said this just means how rotten America is. Then we looked at the Boston Marathon bombings, which occurred during our period. And this is a very interesting and complex process, maybe the most interesting. Very strikingly, there were only 9% of the tweets. These are non-tweets that are not the ones that simply retweet news, but people expressing some opinion. Only 9% expressed sympathy for the victims. How terrible this is. These poor people were killed for no fault of their own. 15%, substantially more, expressed conspiracy theories. There was a big boost in the couple days, because we have it day by day, so a big boost in the couple days after the bombing in the view that the CIA and the FBI were behind it. They set up these guys, these Muslims. They weren't really guilty. It was the CIA, FBI. And that's probably the strongest evidence we have in all of this of bias. I could code that as bias because it was pretty clear from the stories right away that there was a lot of evidence about these guys, and one of them was shot and cornered. It wasn't as if this was unknown who did it for a long time, and you could speculate like the Kennedy assassination. So there were about a third of them, not surprisingly, were worried about backlash against Muslim. About 40% said the event wasn't important. This it typically was. Why is it important that 3 people were killed in Boston? The Israelis are killing Palestinians by the scores every day. So those sorts of responses were not surprising. They were mostly sort of pro-in-group responses. But the striking thing to me is that there is some real evidence of bias. We did, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but we did look at, you get a little bit ghoulish doing this kind of work because I was about to say fortunately it's not fortunate, but it so happens that the same month or a month later, you may remember there was a soldier who was hacked to death on the street in London randomly by some Muslim terrorists. And we did a similar monitor for that, and it was quite different. There was no sentiment that this was a conspiracy by the British Secret Service. It was market. I mean, it's only 15% here, so it's not talking about the whole population. But there was certainly a greater degree of willingness to believe that the U.S. Secret Services were involved in a conspiracy on the Boston Marathon bombing than there was to believe in this actually fairly similar event of innocent people being killed by terrorist act in London. We then, having looked at the Innocence of Muslims video, we asked ourselves, after Hurricane Sandy came along, we asked ourselves, well, it's conceivable that people would think that Hurricane Sandy is punishment for the innocence of Muslims. The Americans do this terrible thing to Muslims, and God is going to respond. And so we looked at this, and we didn't find what we expected. We found something of what we expected, but we found something different too. About 10% of the tweeters essentially had messages that sounded like that. That God has wreaked his vengeance on America for being so anti-Muslim. But about an equal number responded, because people are always responding on Twitter to say, no, that's not true. And about a third regard the event as insignificant. Who cares what happens to the East Coast of the United States? But the striking thing is that about 25% of the tweets commented favorably on Obama's performance, especially afterwards. And they said things like, well, President Obama is actually going out there trying to comfort the people who hurt our leaders. Don't do that. So it was this ambivalent reaction toward the United States. It was a way, of course, of criticizing their own leaders, and it might be safer than simply saying Sisi ought to be shot or something. But there was a much more ambivalent reaction. And this is some evidence that we think suggests that there is a substantial distinction between how U.S. policy is viewed and how the U.S. as a society is viewed. So we can look once again at the political versus social dimension and the impact of the U.S. abroad versus U.S. domestic activities. And it's certainly true that both political and social events, like U.S. policy toward Egypt or Israel or Palestine or Syria, and social events like the Innocence of Muslims video, they both can cause anti-American traffic, no question. But U.S. domestic activities generate ambivalence more than hostility, whereas U.S. policy generates almost uniform hostility, very little ambivalence. So we asked ourselves, well, okay, if we've discovered that it's U.S. intervention that generates the hostility, not the U.S. writ large, look at another state, not the U.S. or aligned with, that intervenes in the Arab world. Answer is Iran, because Iran is a powerful state, and it intervenes in the Arab world. As you know, it's very active in Syria, and it's active in Palestine. And if you look at the volume of activity, there's a lot of traffic about Iran. You can see it's actually remarkably 2/3 as much as there is about the United States, and a little more than about Israel, which are the big three. None of them liked by the Twitterati in the Arab world. So we took a look at this, and we did the same thing we did with the U.S. And it was the views are overwhelmingly negative. And what was interesting is that in our method, we have to find some positive tweets in order to train them. We couldn't find any. So we couldn't train the monitor to find us positive tweets about Iran. There weren't any. To approximation, there weren't. I'm sure if you looked at the millions of them, there were a few, but they weren't enough to pop out. So there were neutral ones, and there were political ones, and there were negative ones. There were no positive ones. That is, it seemed to us, at least, that there was, toward the U.S., there was a strong negativism toward U.S. policy, likewise toward Iran. toward the U.S., a kind of fascination with an ambivalence toward, I won't say favorable, it's mostly negative, but ambivalence toward U.S. society and toward Iran, there was no such positive, there were no positive tweets. So if we look at anti-Americanism and summarize it, do people in the Middle East hate what America does? Yes. Unqualified yes. Do they hate what America is? No. They're not favorable. They're on the whole disposed negatively, but they're ambivalent. And they see aspects of U.S. society which they actually like. There is some data in the public opinion data, by the way, which supported that. For example, people were asked by Pew in 2003 whether they thought that people from their country who had emigrated to the U.S. had a better life. And on the whole, it wasn't a huge majority, but on the whole, majority said they had a better life, which suggests that they don't think that gave us a sense that there wasn't this sort of blanket negativism toward the U.S. society. So this is consistent with public opinion data. Is there bias as well as distrust? Well, there's some, not maybe a huge amount. It certainly came out in the Boston Marathon bombing, most seriously, and anti-Americanism does vary with events. So, and we think that that what we call anti-Americanism in the Middle East is largely anti-interventionism. It's opposition to interference by powerful states. We've equated it with anti-Americanism because that's the most powerful state, and that's the one that we have focused on. So I want to conclude, and then I'm going to show you something from just yesterday. So from a general point of view, we have this, what I'm calling this discordant discourse of social media, where people who have very different attitudes, very different experiences, are now in the same media universe with each other, where they didn't used to be 15 years ago before they weren't in the same universe. And powerful states can't control the social media sites abroad. The U.S. can't control the sites, nor can anybody else. The discourse is much more horizontal. And so that the interventionism, it seems to me, hasn't probably changed a lot. The U.S. has been intervening in the Middle East for 60 years, more than that, but 60 years since the Iranian Revolution, which was an explicit intervention. But it reverberates through social media, and I think it increased the cost to intervening states. Now, what do I do, Joanna, to get this other thing? All right. Okay, Steve, you can, thanks. This is, so we just looked this last month at, we are sort of in a ghoulish situation. Something terrible happens and we respond. Yeah, okay. Just scroll down with this. Regular, yeah, okay. Yeah, this all I want to show is, so as you know, 3 Muslims were killed in Chapel Hill, murdered in early February. And there was a view taken by a lot of people in the U.S. and the Middle East that the media didn't care. The media didn't react fast enough. The police didn't react. They called it they weren't willing to call it a hate crime. And there was a hashtag Muslims Lives Matter that got 900,000 hits in the first day, I think, about this. So what we asked ourselves for this, a little different question, but related, was Crimson Hexagon keeps updating their things, and in this work we couldn't identify location of people. Actually, we know what language they're tweeting in, but some of these Arabic speakers might be in the United States. But now they have a way to geolocate. So we could identify English speakers in the U.S. and Arabic speakers in the Middle East. There were lots of both. There were many more of the English speakers, of course, but there were something like 33,000 of the Arabic speakers reacting in the first few days in the Middle East too. So we asked the question, do the reactions look similar of these two sets of people? English-speaking Americans, Arabic-speaking people in the Middle East. And if you've believed in the clash of civilizations rhetoric, which is very big right now in Congress, you would think, yes, there should be a dramatic difference between these. That is, there should be much more outrage in the Middle East, and than in the United States. There should be a striking difference between them, and there should be in the U.S. quite a bit, if you take this symmetrically, of anti-Muslim sentiment coming out from this, nevertheless. And you can see, tell me how you interpret this. We found that this was not the case. The top figure is the Arabic Middle East, and the bottom figure is the English language Middle East. So start with the large bars, which are almost identical. These were statements of outrage and hypocrisy. The media doesn't care about Muslim lives. Why don't they react? The police don't care because they're Muslims who were killed. If these had been Caucasians who'd been killed by Muslims, we would have had just the opposite reaction. Almost identical percentages said that, and this was the dominant sentiment. The second, the orange category of the top bar is calls for collective action. We should do something about this. And there are somewhat more in the Arab world, 50% more proportionally, but it's not orders of magnitude different. And there are quite a few people in both sets say, yes, we should act, we should get together and protest this. And likewise, there's a category, I don't know how distinct this really is, the kind of category of mourning, and we mourn the loss. That doesn't seem so different from the major one to me. I'm not sure. That's a sharp line. Once again, somewhat more in the Middle East. And lo and behold, there is a category in the U.S. which is negative, which are tweets like that. We have some samples here. Samples are above. We have some examples. All the Muslim outrage over Chapel Hill serves as a reminder of how little outrage Muslims show for Muslim terrorism, that kind of tweet. That, of course, there are none of those that we could find in the Arab world, in Arabic, but only about 8% in the U.S. So we interpret this as argument against the clash of civilizations thesis. Not that it's totally identical, but it's certainly not, it's not like two opposite perceptions of the same event. The perceptions on the whole seem fairly similar. Now, there's a caveat for this. The caveat is that some of these people tweeting in English in the U.S. are Arab Americans or Muslims. But given that population of the U.S. is probably only 1 or 2% of the population, it seems unlikely that it's dominated by them. Although you can't be sure because you can't separate that out. You know where they are and you know what language they're tweeting in. That's all. So, but it does suggest that the clash of civilizations argument isn't right. So both of these, I'll take all three of the general, apart from the fact that we already knew that sentiment is very negative in the Middle East against U.S. intervention. I think all three of these findings cohere a little bit. That is, the finding that there's ambivalence, not unremitting hostility toward the United States. The finding that the views toward Iran are actually more negative than toward the United States. And the lack of support for a dramatic two different worlds perception of the Chapel Hill bombings all suggest to me that the relationship between the Arabic-speaking public in the United States as a country is much more complex and ambivalent than much of the public discourse would lead you to believe. That's what I wanted to say.